Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and your mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. Ephesians 6, 1 through 3. So that's St. Paul quoting the fifth commandment in the New Testament, in the book of Ephesians. You may also call it the fourth commandment, depending on what church you go to. Some churches count it differently. But the fifth commandment is the commandment to honor your father and your mother. And, of course, we often hear about this commandment on the personal basis. Honor your father and your mother on the personal level. And I do try to do that. And I would imagine that most of the viewers listening try to do that as well. And also, of course, for our grandparents as well. But I also think about this more on the societal level at the moment. And particularly when it comes to religion. How do we honor our fathers and our mothers with religion? And I've been thinking a lot about that, particularly in the context of universalism. How do we honor our spiritual fathers and mothers? So if you watch the channel for any long period of time, you know that I believe that Universalists should try to redenominationalize. I think that we should try to rebuild the Universalist Church of America, which is originally founded in 1793 and existed until 1961. I'm very pro rebuilding the Universalist Church of America, and I've spoken about many reasons why I think this is a good idea. But I was pondering, the fifth commandment the other day, and particularly how can, what is the best way we can ensure that our children, if you have young children or you're thinking about having children at some point, what is the best way to ensure that our children can keep the Universalist faith? Because I'm sure that we all want our children to keep our faith, both as Christians, but also our Universalist faith, don't we? And I was thinking, what is the best way to ensure, my children, my grandchildren, et cetera, can keep to that faith? And I was thinking about that, and I was like, clearly the best way is to get them involved in a church that believes in universalism. Definitely teaching universalism in the home and all that's very important, but often how religion, transcends generation after generation is people are involved in a church and they get committed to a church and they, keep with that church and they keep that form of Christianity in their family for generations. And that's typically how it goes. And of course, a church is, especially in traditional American society and European society, is at the heart of a lot of central things. You get baptized or dedicated, depending on what denomination you're in, but you get, as an infant, you're baptized / dedicated at the church. You get confirmed at the church. You get married at the church, and you get buried at the church. So key moments of people's lives happen traditionally at the church. And, you spend every Sunday at the church traditionally. And, traditionally the church plays a big role in people's lives. And I was thinking that the best way to keep the Universalist faith multi-generational is a church. Because people tend to keep the faith if they get involved with the church that preaches it. So that to me is like, why should you support redenominationalization, which is a major part of the mission of this channel, is to try to re-encourage redenominationalization of the Universalist Church. I'm trying to re-encourage the reconstruction of the Universalist Church. And I think the best reason is simple. Do you want your children, your grandchildren, it's pretty much, do you want your kin after you die to hold the universalism? And I think the best way to do that is to to get involved or start. There's multiple different options, but it's to get involved with the church that preaches universalism. And I've been thinking a lot about this, honoring the fifth commandment. And definitely just how do we honor the other 10 commandments in the context of, our wider religious practices. To me, a big reason I do fight for the preservation of the Universalist tradition is my freedom of religion. I've been thinking about this, that really the most important freedom of all is freedom of religion, aka, freedom of belief, the freedom to believe what you believe is right and to be able to practice that. And I think that is the most important freedom of all, because if you don't have the freedom to believe, then all the other freedoms are pointless, because if you can't defend, there's nothing to defend. What's the point of all the other freedoms? So freedom of belief is the most important freedom. And I've been thinking about freedom of belief, freedom of religion, and my practice of it. And I do feel that the more I've thought about it, the more I see that when we lost the Universalist Church, Universalists fundamentally lost their freedom of religion. Lay Universalists lost the freedom to worship God. They believe is the most honoring to Him, and so a church that teaches the correct doctrine doesn't teach this fear-based version of God. Ministers, we lost our freedom to preach without fear. We now had to be a part of denominations where we have to compromise one way or another on our Universalist beliefs. Parents lost the freedom to raise their children in the faith within a church that believes in it, and we lost our freedom to evangelize to the world, both Christians and non-Christians alike. We've lost a lot of that freedom because we've lost our church, our denomination. So I realize increasingly that universalism, the preservation of the Universalist heritage, is key to preserving freedom and our freedom of religion. And I've been thinking a lot about that. And how do we honor our spiritual fathers and mothers? Another reason I think that we should try to keep the Universalist Church and preserve that heritage is honoring our spiritual fathers and mothers. I think of men like John Murray or Elhanan Winchester, these great preachers that preached all throughout the American colonies in Britain. And they did all this great preaching and all this great work. Where it was said that they thought Elhanan Winchester was going to die in the pulpit towards the end because Winchester was getting very sickly towards the end of his life, but he kept preaching. Very devout man, along with John Murray. They were both very devout Christian men, and they preached the gospel. And I'm thinking a lot about how we honor that heritage, the heritage of all those Universalists that came before us. And I think it is to continue to fight for the Universalist heritage. And I've also been thinking a lot about on this, idea of how do we, honor our fathers and mothers, spiritual fathers and mothers, preserving the faith and passing the faith down. I've also just been thinking about, Christianity in general, where just today, and I was already trying to make a video like this, but just today I saw a video from a channel I sometimes watch, Religion for Breakfast, and he makes general world religion content. And he made, a video talking about the myth, quote unquote, of Gen Z revival. And he pretty much pointed out, well, if you look at the major statistics of like Christian identification in America, nothing's really changed. Like, yes, it's not really going down anymore, but Gen Z is still a very secular generation. And he's like, well, we're not seeing this massive change in the numbers. And that is true. We're not seeing, like, in Christian identification, we're not seeing a massive change in the numbers. We're not seeing a massive change downwards anymore, but we're not seeing a massive change upwards. But he did not mention several key points of evidence. Like, I've pointed this out many times before on the channel. Bible sales have exploded since the turn of the decade. Like, I think I heard, like, they're up over 40% since 2022 alone. And I know in 2025, like, Bible sales massively skyrocketed. Another statistic I recently learned about is that religious apps, downloads of religious apps are up 80% since 2019. And I also have heard that the popularity of like a contemporary Christian worship on like Spotify and stuff, which is I'm young, but I'm like an old man because I still listen to the radio, and I also hate contemporary Christian worship, so I can't speak too much on it. But I have heard that it's up about 50% since like 2019, like the popularity of it on like Spotify and stuff. So we've seen a massive increase, and like those are like more objective numbers. That, and I think if you just look anecdotally, I think you see a massive revival. Like it's very obvious. Like if you look back to the 2010s. And you look in the 2020s, that Christian content on YouTube and other social media platforms is way more popular and has way more young people watching it than in the past. I talk about Redeemed Zoomer a few times on the channel. He, about a year ago now, I want to say, he had a poll. And he pretty much asked, were you a Christian before you watched this channel? Yada yada, did my videos have any effect on you? And pretty much over 1,000 people said that in part because of his videos that they had become a Christian. And the bulk of his audience are young people. So like I do think there's clearly a real revival happening. You're having a lot of people tell stories that they were non-religious and they're becoming Christian. Like a revival is clearly happening. We're seeing, just anecdotally, I've heard from many different ministers and stuff from like college campuses and stuff that like there's a massive there's a massive resurgence in interest. So yes, those numbers haven't caught up yet, and definitely I would say we live in a wheat and chaff time, a time, wheat from the chaff, and why people that identify as Christian, that may be stagnating. We are clearly seeing an increase of actual Christians. One thing I'm very grateful the Baptists really beat into me is that, you're not a Christian because you say you're a Christian. You're not a Christian because you were raised a Christian. You're not a Christian even because you go to church. You're a Christian because you've legitimately had a change of heart and truly believe. And why these numbers of, I'm a, Christian identification in the United States is, it's more stagnated around 60%. Well, those numbers have, they're not great, but they're not exactly terrible either. It's very clear, and I've already talked about some more objective ways of measuring it. I frequently talk about the increase in Bible sales because that's like a very, I think a very on the nose, okay, people are buying Bibles because they're reading Bibles, and if they're reading Bibles, they're clearly interested in the Christian religion. Since the Bible is the best way to learn more about Christianity, that's why I talk about that one a lot. But I think just by more objective measures, like the increase in Bible sales, and also just very subjective measures, I've been to Orthodox churches before, and just there's a lot of young people at Orthodox church. I mean, and you can, not every single parish, but a lot of them, anecdotally, I mean, I've seen it with my own eyes, and a lot of other people can tell you that visit them. There's been a massive resurgence of young people in those churches, or traditional Latin Mass churches, and also traditional Protestant churches. I know a lot of Anglican churches are doing very well. I've been to these churches. I've seen the young people there. So we are seeing a massive increase in Christianity in the West. And I say all this, and this ties back into what I was saying earlier about preserving the Universalist heritage, is that I think right now is an ideal time because I've come to realize I believe that we are living in a slow revival. I don't think it's going to be one big dramatic thing all over. It's not going to be overnight. 10 years from now, the United States is not going to be, some Christian utopia, but rather it will be a slow march. I think about our current world paradigm. Our current world paradigm begins in 1914 with the beginning of World War I. And World War I would go on to have very profound effects on particularly European, but also American society. All of Western civilization will be profoundly affected by World War I. You can see it in art. Paintings radically changed after World War I. Architecture radically changed. The culture. Most of the degeneracy we see today began in the 1920s. So that you just see this radical change in culture and the way of life in the 20s. And that was massively sped up in the 60s. And we see that today. That thing is it took time though. 1964 is 50 years after World War I, and yet 1964, society was still pretty functional in 1964. Even in 1994, society's pretty functional, but you see that slow decline, slowly creeping in. You see the slow fading away of morals and beliefs. You start seeing things slowly break down, and now everything's sped up, and we're seeing I think the beginning of the end of that paradigm of history. We're seeing where the era that came before it begins with the French Revolution, begins in 1789 with the French Revolution, and also simultaneously in 1789 the American Constitution creating the Republic. So essentially in 1789 you have the first French Republic and you have the American Republic being born, and that marks the beginning of an era in history, and that era in history lasts till 1914. Where I think now that the era of history we live in is coming to an end. What began with World War I and then was sped up by World War II is coming to an end now, and that's what we're seeing. And therefore, I think the ideas of the 20th century are beginning to fade with it. Primarily, the 20th century secularization hypothesis that religion would gradually fade away, I think, is beginning to be proven wrong. And yes, it's starting small, but the parable of the mustard seed, it's starting small, but it will grow into a mighty tree. And I think in time, Christianity will come back. It is coming back. I see it now. Even the fact that the number of non-religious people has massively slowed. Like it went from, once again, I remember in the 2010s, it was like Christianity is going to be dead in 20 years because the nuns are just exploding. I remember that. I remember in 2022 when the atheists and the Pew. This is what I always talk about. In 2022, the Pew Research Center released a paper pretty much saying that Christianity in America was in its last days. Within 30 years, we were going to be gone. Christianity was just going to collapse. And I remember the atheists just cheered and hooped and hollered, and they were like, yes. And then 1 year later, in 2023, the Pew Research Center says the number of non-religious people in America has stopped growing. 1 year. We went from Christianity is over to the number of non-religious people stopped growing. And I really do think the Asbury revival in 2023 was the beginning of a massive spiritual awakening. I think that was the Holy Spirit beginning to move like he had never, well, he's moved before, but like he hasn't moved in a long time, and we're seeing it now. I think just from 2023 to now in 2026, I think it's safe to say that Christianity is in its better place. I mean, people are clearly more interested in Christianity. So while perhaps the number of people that identify as Christians in America may continue to decline, I don't really worry about that because I don't think a lot of those people are true Christians. Yes, we are still seeing people that were raised, Christians, and we're genuine Christians, because I do think a genuine Christian can fall away. But, we see people that were Christians and we see them falling away. We still see that, but we're seeing, I think, way more people. Once again, like if you go back to the 2010s to the 2000s, I mean, the internet was dominated with those stories of people that, they were Christians and they left. And you still see plenty of those, but I really do think you're starting to see more stories of people that were not Christians and became Christians. And I just think we are seeing a revival. And one thing I would definitely point out as a student of American religious history is that for whatever reason, and we don't really know, religious revivals happened like clockwork in the 40s decades in America. The 1740s is the First Great Awakening. The 1840s is the tail end, but also the height of the Second Great Awakening. The 1940s is the beginning of the post-war religious boom, where the 1950s would mark the highest period of church attendance in American history. And I believe the 2040s will also be a period of religious revival in America. I just think about if the 2040s are 20 more years away, 2046, but I mean, it's pretty much 15, 20 years from now is the 2040s. I think to myself, things are already so crazy and just falling apart now that we've rejected God. I couldn't imagine the world in 15, 20 years after we've rejected God even further. So I do think by the 2040s particularly, there will be more revival. And yeah, I know this part may seem a bit disconnected from how I started the video, but what I'm trying to say is that the way that we can reach people with universalism now, and I think this is the ideal time to rebuild the Universalist Church, because I think there's increasing interest in Christianity, even if a lot of people won't admit it. I do think Christianity is increasing, and it will continue to increase because people are tired of the way things are. And I think now is the time. As Universalists, I think really now is the time, because I look back at the Second Great Awakening, and Universalism was actually able to be successful in the Second Great Awakening and gain a real following. There for a time, there were several 100,000, at least that's what some numbers would say, but at the very least, there was a lot of Universalists in America. Like in the 1840s, for instance, there was a massive interest in the doctrine, and it was becoming mainstream. And I do think that if we play our cards right, and if we try to strengthen Universalism now, that's why I made the map. The idea is pretty simple. We get people to attend Universalist churches, we'll strengthen the Universalist churches, and if there's Universalist churches around, more people hopefully can come to Universalism. But I really do think the time is now. I do think that we got to think long term. That's what I always think. It's not all about the next 5 years and the next 10 years. It's about the next 50, the next 100. I think that If we focus on rebuilding the Universalist Church now, in this time, like how the Israelites rebuilt the Second Temple, eventually later generations will reap that fruit. We may not fully see it now, but if we focus on rebuilding the Universalist Church now, later generations will reap the fruit. Later generations will benefit from having a denomination that actually preaches universalism. And I really think that will benefit in the future if we focus on redenominationalization of some variety, whether it be some kind of I think the future is probably a multi-denominational association of different churches that believe in universalism across different denominations, along with independent churches that are just plain universalist. I think that's the future. As much as I would like to go back to 1900 and the traditional universalist model, I do think that things will adapt and change. But I do think that if we rebuild some form of denominational universalism in America, that will reap massive benefits, that it will keep our faith alive for many generations to come. So yeah, I think we're on the cusp of a massive revival. It may not be big and flashy, but it will be a slow taking of Christianity. And this is what I think will happen. It's a slow march for the institutions. It's a slow changing of the order. It won't happen overnight, but slowly but surely we will take back civilization. I'm convinced of that. I think that Christianity will slowly take back what has been lost. And I think that 100 years from now, I think the world will be a much more Christian place. I'm convinced of that. And I've spoken about that in the past, and I'll probably make another video at some point about my thoughts about the future of Christianity within the 21st century and what I think is a realistic vision for a Christian future. Anyways, this is my brief little thing. Just get involved with the Universalist Church, as I always say. Or at the very least, join a church that's friendly to universalism. I think really the time is now, and I do think that we live in a massive, period of change, and I think that we're going to see great changes on the horizon. So I think right now is a great time to be alive. At least, a lot of people look back even nostalgically at the 2010s, and I'm gonna be honest. I mean, I don't like the craziness of the 2020s, but at the same time, I do. I think it's just very exciting to be alive in a time where you really know that what you're doing now will really impact the way the world will be in 100 years, where you know that what the decisions we make today will change the world. I really do feel that. I feel like the 2010s was a period of massive denial in the world where we all had our heads in the sands and we didn't really notice all the evil in the world. We were kept up with a bunch of petty nonsense. But I think now a lot of people are waking up to the truth. I think 2020, will be probably like another 1914 in future history books. I think that will be a year that will mark a massive change in global paradigms, just like 1789 or 1914. I think that will be one of those years that something changed in the global paradigm. Anyways, that's all I got to say today. Thank you for watching. God bless, and Christ will conquer.